said, there are so many teachings of the church, so many of them, but not all of them are social. So in other words, the teachings that are socials are those that we call the Catholic social teachings. And they began from the encyclical. By encyclical, we mean that, for those of us who are not familiar with that concept, encyclical, literally letters by the Pope, written to the church as a form of a teaching, as a form of an encouragement, as a form of an exhortation. So the concept of the Catholic social teaching began from Pope Leo XIII as of 1891 precisely, when Pope Leo, considering the situation of Europe as at then, put up an encyclical called Rerum Novarum. So from Pope Leo to Pope Francis, there has been a body of work that concerns social issues. They've written these various popes, from Pope Leo to Francis, have written, of course, so many other letters and encyclical beyond social issues. But from Pope Leo to Pope Francis, and I'm talking about Pope Francis' encyclical of last year, 2020, called the Fratelli Tutti, from Pope Leo, Rerum Novarum, to Fratelli Tutti, you have this body of work that you call the Catholic social teachings. But that is not all. The body of work, or what make up the Catholic social teachings, are not just letters from the Pope. There are also some congregations within the church. For example, the Congregation for the Doctrine and Faith also have produced some materials that are also regarded as the Catholic social teachings. And of course, as I have it here, I have also the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace that have also produced what is understood as a compendium of the Catholic social doctrine. So these are the body of work, these are the materials, these are the resources that we refer to as the Catholic social teachings. But the concern should be this. Are we saying that the church only began to talk about social issues in 1891? Are we saying that the church has never spoken about social issues before 1891? You know that the church has always spoken and has always thought about social issues before 1891. But the problem is this. (1891) was a different environment about church involvement in social issues. Of course, by the time of the earliest Christian, there is a paper, there is a document called the Didache. And in that very document that is believed to be the teachings of the apostles handed over to the earliest Christians, there are some concerns about some social issues. So right from the earliest Christians, the church have been making conversation about social issues. So what is different about Pope Leo XIII? What is different about Rerum Novarum? A couple of things. Mind you, as at 1891, the church of like centuries ago was not the church of 1891. The Papa state, for example, has become reduced. Europe has become fractionalized, and so on and so forth. Secondly, the issues that were mentioned in 1891 were some of the issues in which, though the church has been articulating theologically, but not in the form that it was articulated by Pope Leo XIII. For example, unionism, the right of workers. Of course, if we trace the theology of the church back to centuries, we can extrapolate seriously ideas about the right of workers. Also, what was new about 1891 was that prior to 1891, there was no problem of socialism or communism, as the case may be, with the European economy and with which the church had to be concerned with. These were some of economic issues, social issues that Pope Leo had to contend with. So in other words, with Pope Leo XIII Rerum Novarum, things change. And from there, from him, Rerum Novarum, we started having these letters and encyclical called the Catholic Social Teachings. Remember, I said that how can we think politically and socially using Catholic doctrine? For example, in Nigeria, in a country where there are various and many religions. How do you think like that? How do you think politically without giving an impression that you're trying to proselytize other people? So in other words, what is the audience? Who are the people the Pope has spoken to when writing the social encyclicals? Who are the audience? If you look at what you can see in your screen, for every encyclical, there is always, like I said, it's a kind of a letter, right? And the letter is always addressed, every letter is addressed to somebody. And of course, every Pope, every encyclical is also addressed to people. With Rerum Novarum, I wanted to pay attention to the difference between Rerum Novarum and Pacem in Terris. From Pope Leo to Pope John the 23rd. I wanted to pay attention to the difference. What is the difference here? Rerum Novarum wrote to venerable brethren, patriarchs, primates, archbishops, bishops, all the leaders of the various congregations, and also those who are in communion with the Apostolic See, that is the Vatican. Close to about 40 years afterwards, Pope Pius XI also wrote another encyclical 40 years after Rerum Novarum. He also wrote to who? Our venerable brethren, the patriarchs, primates, archbishops, other ordinaries, and also those in communion with the Apostolic See. But now there is a little bit of difference if you look at that. Pope Pius added one more thing to the Catholic faithful. In other words, the attention, the audience from Pope Pius XI started to expand. If you now look at Pope John the 23rd, to who he addressed? Again, to our venerable brethren, the ordinaries, the archbishops, every other person that other popes had mentioned. But now one more thing, he now added, now expanded it. To who? Men and women of what? Of goodwill. In other words, at this point, the reference is no longer to the Catholic world. Pope John the 23rd was now communicating with those outside the Catholic world. And if you pay attention, if you look at the date that Pope John the 23rd wrote that letter, you will remember that something was already happening in the life of the church, right? We'll all remember that Pope John the 23rd began the Second Vatican Council, and which was an ecumenical council that was not just about the Catholic Church, but also that discussed documents about the church interaction, not just with the non-Catholics, but also with other religions. So in other words, with Pope John the 23rd, he was acting, writing his encyclicals in a way that reflected the Second Vatican Council, even before the council was concluded. So, if we are not going to write, if the Pope is not going to write to Catholics and non-Catholics, how does he write? Mind you, for those who are even Christians, not everything that is theological in the Catholic world makes meaning to those who are non-Catholic. So how does the Pope now write to Catholic and non-Catholic? How does the Pope speak to Catholic and non-Catholic in a single letter? In other words, what we call the Catholic social teachings. What form of argument is this body of work? As in other words, how does a document make its argument? Of course, for everything that has to do with the church, the scripture is very important. Like I said, the Catholic social teachings are drawn from the life, the event of Jesus Christ. And as such, the scripture has to be involved. So the Pope, the congregations make arguments through the scriptures in Catholic social teachings. So how does a Muslim, for example, now understand the Catholic, a Christian scripture, and since a Muslim also is also either a man or a woman of goodwill? There's another form of argument that is being used in the Catholic social teachings. What is that argument? Natural law theory. In other words, we're looking at the logic, so to speak, extrapolated from natural human ordering. That there is a way in which the human life, human nature has been ordered. So when we pay attention and meditate on that natural aspect of the human life, there is a kind of logic that we can extrapolate from that and use that as an argument. If we have time to read, by GS here, I mean Gaudium et Spes, and by RN, I mean Rerum Novarum, and the PP is Populorum Progressio. That is Gaudium et Spes number 36, Rerum Novarum number 11, and the Populorum Progressio number 16. Let me use the argument of the Rerum Novarum as an example. Pope Leo was challenging the socialism of his age that was taking over the life of the families. In other words, there was an attempt by the various governments who had adopted socialism to replace the natural nature of family with the government. So, Pope Leo was making an argument that the most natural state of the human person is the family. And as such, the attempt that the socialist government or the communist government were trying to make was something that was contrary to nature. Pope John Paul II would make the argument deeper, in his further encyclical, especially the Solicitor Res Socialis, in which Pope John Paul II mentioned that it was an abnormality of how to understand the human person for a government to think that it can take over the role of the mother or the father of the family. So you see what I was talking about here, using natural nature, using the natural logic to make an argument. And this argument can appeal to anybody regardless of his or her religious affiliation. And of course, the other way of making this argument is through what I call the ecclesiological foundation. In other words, we look at what is called the divine revelation, and we interpret divine revelations through human experiences. What that means is that social conditions, social issues are human experiences. And social issues keep evolving from time to time. So how do we use the doctrine of the church, some of which are constant and consistent, how do we marry them with new issues? How do we marry them with new concern? How do we marry them with new problems, so to speak? This is another way of making this argument. So, having mentioned how we make the argument in Catholic social teachings. Like I said, what I'm trying to do at this point is to lay out, so to speak, a kind of a general idea of what the Catholic social teaching is all about. But I'm going to do more analysis when I start to go into the principles. But first off, I want to mention the principles. What are they? There are 4 of them, and the 4 can be also subdivided into some other thing. But let's look at the 4 first. Remember, when I began, I mentioned that the doctrine in the Catholic social teaching is the fact that the human person is the center of the teachings of the church. Not just that the human person is the center, but also because of the dignity of the human person. And as such, one of the first principle of the Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person. That every human person created in God's image and likeness is dignified. And for that reason, there are consequences in quote of that dignity. That's the first principle. And this principle undergirds every social teaching of the church. Secondly, there is an idea of the common good, the notion of the common good, and also the reality of the common good. These are words that I'm sure of. We've read a couple of times, but what does that mean? When we say the common good, what does it mean? And the next part of this conversation, I will be going into that. So primarily in the next session of this conversation, I'll be going into the principle of the person and the common good, primarily. But there are also other principles which you have there. The principle of subsidiarity, in which in the next session, I'm going to describe briefly what it means. And of course, we have the principle of solidarity. And of course, like I said, in the next session, I'm going to describe briefly what it means. So what I've done right now is to lay out roughly what we mean by the Catholic social teachings, or in some other places, the Catholic social doctrine. And I've tried to explain what we mean by the doctrinal aspect of those teachings. I try to explain also that the Catholic social teachings are teachings of the church drawn from the event, the life, and of course the teaching of Christ. And there are ways of making these arguments in the mind of the church. And I mentioned 3 ways of making this argument. First, I talked about scripture. We use the scripture to make this analysis. We use a natural law theory to make this analysis. And we use the doctrine of the church in conversation with new realities to make this analysis. And by using all these 3 analyses, 3 modes of making this argument, the Catholic social teaching is not just for Catholics, but also for men and women of goodwill, because every social issue is not just a Catholic problem, it's a human problem. And as such, the Catholic social teaching is concerned, of course, with Catholics. How do Catholics think, discuss, dialogue, and act socially and politically? But of course, Catholics don't act just with themselves. They also act with some other human beings who are non-Catholics. So in other words, the Catholic social teaching also have a conversation with those who are non-Catholics. So in preparation for the next session that we're going to run, for the next session, there are a couple of ideas in which I want us to think about for about a few minutes before we go into the next session. If you can look at it, if you can see your screen, Is there a difference in your mind? I've been consciously using the word person. But so is there a difference in your mind between a person and a human being? One would say someone is a person, one would say somebody is a human being. Is there? Or within your culture, the culture that you're familiar with, you feel that the culture made a distinction between being a person and between being a human being? Remember, I said the first principle of Catholic social teaching is the human dignity. How do we acquire that? How do we acquire human dignity? What does it mean to be dignified? And lastly, one would say the common good, the communion of good. What does that mean? In your own little way, what does this mean to you before we go into the next session to articulate them one after the other, while we will pay attention, primary attention, to the dignity of the person and the common good. So we will split into groups. Right now, I think we can have about 3 groups to look at these questions. And I think Ether will take care of those on Zoom. Ether, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I will move you all into breakout rooms on Zoom, and we'll put these discussion questions in the chat so you have them. I will remain in the main room. If you have any questions or issues, you can always come back to the main room and ask me. I will send you all to your rooms now.
We're all very familiar with the book of Genesis. We are familiar with the creation account. And no matter how often we read this passage of the Bible, it's always new. And for every time we talk about the human person, the book of Genesis is foundational. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 is very important to our conversation today. God created man, or the human person, whichever one you want to use, in God's image and likeness, or in his image and likeness. The last part of that verse is very important. Male and female, he created them. Now, 2 sentences are very key to every conversation about human dignity. God created the human person in his own image and likeness. That means something. And one of the things implied by God creating the human person in God's image and likeness is the fact that the human person participates in the life of God. The human person is like God in some form. That is a very big statement to make. To call the human person God in some form, not God, but to call the human person God in some form, it's a very ambitious statement. But not just it's not only ambitious, but it's also real to some extent. And for the fact that the human person is created in God's image and likeness, that grounds the whole idea of the human dignity. In other words, because the human person participates in God, the human person also shares in the dignity of God. So when you say the human person is dignified, we are making a very big statement to say that the human person is not just God in some sense, but also shares the dignity in some respect, in some form, the dignity of God. At the statement, it's a statement that it's big, as I've said, because Aquinas made us to understand that there is a way in which every creature of God participates in God. There is a way in which every creature of God reflects God in a sense. So creating human being in God's image and likeness would now mean that there is no other divine life of God like the human person. When we now say that the human person is dignified, when we say that the human person participates in the dignity of God, they affirm that the more. The life of Jesus, the event of Jesus, confirm that the more. That is to say, we believe in the church that Jesus is the Son of God, yes. But also, Jesus also shows us the perfection of the human person. The human person in its perfect form. Pope Benedict XVI made one big statement that each time I think about it, it's so amazing. Benedict XVI said, when reflecting on a person in Christian theology, Benedict XVI said that there is a way in which we understand the human perfection of Jesus to be once and for all. But Benedict XVI is saying that no, that it seems to be a wrong understanding to see the human perfection of Christ to be once and for all. In other words, the human perfection of Christ is still possible. I'm paying attention to the human perfection of Christ. That the human perfection of Christ is still a reality that is achievable by other human beings. So that is an important statement to be made about what you and I share. That there is a way in which our person participates in God, and there is a way in which our person keeps moving towards that perfection in a way that we can become like Christ was a human person. We now say that the human person, because the human person is created in God's image and likeness, has what is called dignity. And I've spent some time to reflect on that word. And there's no other way to do that other than return to the Latin roots. Simple. It's the vocabulary, the alphabet are similar, as you can see on your screen, dignitas, right? And we can create many words out of the whole idea of dignitas. We can talk about merit, prestige, and all the rest of it. And I was really fascinated with the word merit as another meaning for dignity, dignitas. To say someone merits something is to say someone is deserving of something. But we've had a consciousness that you deserve what you've worked for, which is reasonable. But there is none of us who have worked for the dignity in the way it is being framed as because he or she also possesses that dignity for as long as we know and we understand that the child in the womb is a human person. So the child in the womb also has that dignity. So what has the child in the womb done to deserve something? No, there is nothing your he has done, and there is nothing you and I have done to deserve what we call the dignity that we share with God. Rather, other than the fact that we're created in God's image, we participate in the life of God, and for that reason, we share that from God. The United Nations Human Declaration of Right grounded the whole idea of human right on dignity. But what was not evident in that paper is to trace the origin of the dignity. The paper mentioned that for the fact that every human being has dignity, every human being has right. In other words, on the fact that everyone has a dignity is founded the whole idea of right. But like I said, what that paper, what that document didn't mention is to trace it back from. In other words, to trace the being created in God's image and likeness. Now, so I've done this. So I've been created in God's image and likeness, makes the human person a unique being. But the uniqueness of the human person is not just about the human race. It's also about each person. It's also about each person that has been created. In other words, as in this hall right now, all of us here are Nigerians, right? On Zoom, there are other non-Nigerians, right? But the fact that we share the same nationality, we understand our differences, that we are kind of different. But also is that uniqueness in each and every one of us. And the uniqueness is such that it is not repeatable. It is once you, myself, himself, or ourselves. So this is our own idea of the human person conversation during the first dialogue we had. That the doctrine in the Catholic social teaching is the fact that it is unchangeable, it's never going to end, it's never going to change, that the human person is a dignified being in a different way than all other creatures. And like I said, on this very important principle lays every social teaching. Remove this principle, there's really nothing to talk about. So, it means that for the human person to have dignity, for the human person to have merit, there are some things that are not admissible to being human. By tomorrow, when we read the document Populorum Progressio, Pope Paul VI will mention some of those conditions that are inadmissible to being human. He called those conditions less human condition. In other words, there is absolutely no way we should be comfortable to see a fellow human being in such conditions, because those conditions, they do not in a way represent the dignity that God has given to every human person. And there is absolutely no way in which we can free words to admissible. There is a passage of the Bible that's in verse 19 to 21. We know the parable. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Just take a look at that and begin to pick out the difference between the rich man and Lazarus and see whose dignity is affirmed, whose dignity is not affirmed. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to take a look. In these few lines are loaded a lot of information. So much information in these few lines. And they seriously explicate what I said we're going to take a look at tomorrow. In other words, that there are some conditions that there's absolutely no way you can paint them and make them look good, because those conditions do not represent human condition. They should not in any way represent human condition. And look at what Luke did. Luke situated Lazarus with a dog. And I think that for the Gospel of Luke, that was intentional. Jesus is situating Lazarus and dog. Mind you, in the book of Samuel, remember that combat between David and Goliath, when Goliath told David, like he was coming to him as if he was coming to a dog. That means something. You remember the word of Jesus also, when Jesus also mentioned, that you do not give precious things to dogs, right? So it means that dogs, even though they are pets now these days, but during the time of Jesus, right, they meant something else. So to now put Lazarus and dog together was saying something. That the condition of Lazarus was not a condition of a human person. That there should be no human person that should be in that condition. So what eventually the gift of Lazarus, or rather, what God eventually, the reward of Lazarus was more, like he was near Abraham, was to compensate, so to speak, for what he had missed while he suffered those conditions. Now, having saying that does not mean that heavenly compensation justifies poverty. That is not the intention of this parable. But the intention of this parable is to bring, into conversation one condition that affects someone's dignity, someone's power, someone's self-possession. That was the rich man. Everything that was natural to being human, the rich man had. The dignity, he had it. That should be natural to every human person. Self-possession, in other words, he owned himself. That was natural to the rich man. He had opportunities. That should be natural to everybody, but it was only natural to the rich man. He had his own private property. Remember, Lazarus was in front of his gate. Again, that should be natural to every human being, but only the rich man had it. He had food, not just food, feast. In other words, he was feasting, eating as if every day was a party. But we don't need to feast. But even Lazarus, what should be basic for him to have, he never had it. That shows the difference. Why the person of the rich man was affirmed, the person of Lazarus was denied. Mind you, I've been using the word person repeatedly. It has its own origin in our church, in Catholic church, in Catholic theology. It has its origin. I'm not interested in the philosophical origin, and I won't bore you with that, but let me just briefly run through the Greco-Roman development of the concept and how it was borrowed by the church and what it means for you and I, such that by the time you use the word person next time after today, you know what you're talking about. not just knowing what you're talking about, you are saying something deeper. So, as you can see on your screen, from the Greek word etruscan fesu, the mask. In the Greek-Roman world, the antiquated Greek-Roman world, there used to be a form of drama in which persons would mask like one of the gods of the Greek-Roman world and would take up. He or she would imbibe, would become the god at that point. It will become the first form, the person, the persona. That is the origin of the word. But according to Benedict XVI again, the word was not so much in use, so to speak, until Christianity took it over. And the time that Christianity really appropriated the concept, we remember the Council of Chalcedon, the council that defined the two natures of Christ, two natures, one person. And from that point, the concept of the person began to take another form. It began to mean something, not just a player, not just a role player. It was now becoming a subject, a spiritual subject, someone who owes himself, someone who possesses himself, someone, an individual who is capable of so many things. But that wasn't where it ended, right? Some other fathers of the church also did a lot to develop the concept. There is so much that was done, like I said, by Basil the Great. But what Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa did was different from what Augustine did as regards to person. Because remember, we've been using the word person, but we know, as I know, and as it is reflected in the life of Jesus, that Chalcedon tried to explicate the two natures of Christ. There are also two parts of being human, right? There is the material and there is the immaterial. So there used to be this question: which part is more important? Is it the material part or the spiritual part or the immaterial part? If you ask like Basil the Great pays a lot of attention to the material part, not as against the spiritual part, no. But for Basil the Great, for example, there is no way of getting to know the spiritual without the material. But for someone like Augustine, no. The wisdom of the person, the intelligence of the person, the knowledge of the person is situated in the spiritual part of the person. Now, these analyses are really not so important, but just for you to have an historical background of what it means, how these whole things develop. But for you and I, what has become important for us is the fact that the person is a composite being with the spiritual and also the material part. Who are Igbos here? Can you raise up your hand? Wait, anybody with Igbo? Just wave. Okay, thank you. I've been working on, if I mispronounce, please pardon me. I've been working on the Igbo understanding of Madu. And now that intersects with the Chi. And the more I work on it, the more I realize that the Chi in Igbo philosophy is a reflection, a participant in the Chi that is bigger, which is the Chi naked. And mind you, there is this wonderful thing about Igbo philosophy of Madu. Every Chi, like I said, like every person is unique to himself or herself. Every Chi is personal. That's why they call it like personal Chi. And within the Igbo philosophy, you begin to see that there is an aspect of the capacity of the human person to think for himself or for herself, as the case may be, to own himself or herself, as the case may be, and also to be responsible to himself or herself, as the case may be. And I think the Yoruba people also have this concept. But why I'm drawing on the Igbo tradition is to see that in so many, especially Christianity this time around, the person is not just formed by the material. The person is also formed by the immaterial, which some people call the substance, the essence, as the case may be, and the material, which some people call the matter. This is how the human person is formed. In other words, there is no human person that is formed without these two important parts of the human person. And they interact. That is what makes the person a person. The interaction of both. That is what makes the person the person. These two things about the human person interact with one another. And one other point that I'm going to make as regards is this, before going forward. The interaction between the material and the immaterial moves towards something. Remember I said that Benedict XVI said, the human perfection of Christ is not once in a lifetime. It is possible that a human person can still reach that perfection. And to reach the perfection is a movement. So, the interaction between the material and the immaterial of the person moves towards their perfection. The material moves towards the perfection, while the immaterial moves towards also his own origin, which is God. What I've reflected here also, which I've kind of bypassed moving to other ideas in the whole idea of being a person, is how Boethius and Aquinas, and I think Aquinas has a wonderful description of being a person, and I'm sure you can see that on your screen, which I wouldn't need to go into seriously. When the material and the immaterial interact, please listen to this word I'm going to say. The person, the human being, becomes a person, and he or she becomes a whole to himself. So in other words, there's this thing we say, and for us who do theology, it's a wrong statement. There's this saying that, when we have events, we say VIP, VVIP, right? Very important person and all the rest of it. What qualifies the very important personality qualifies the very person who think he or she is not very important. Because for the interaction, the very person that we or she think we think he or she is not important is formed in the same way the VIP is formed, right? So as the non-important, as we may think about it, as the non-important person is old, so is the very important old. So to say that some VIP is redundant, as I say, because every person, for the fact that he or she is old, whichever person is, acquires that impulse. So, like I said, so of human, but to mean that every society is slightly old does not in any way mean that the old can exist or should exist without the other old. That is our own understanding of person. That the person is also himself and also has the capacity to interact with other old. In other words, that brings together the whole idea of the social relations between persons. So, mind you, I said something in which I'm going to round up this session. I've spent close to my 30 minutes. The person is a composite being, spiritual and material. And I said both move towards their perfection. But one thing I didn't mention is the fact that we understand that there is a limitation. The material part of the human person is limited in the way it moves towards perfection. The matter is limited in the way it moves towards perfection. So while the immaterial could move to the extent in which the person disposes it to move, the material is limited. Now, but despite the fact that the material is limited, the material still needs perfection. Listen to this. Because the material needs to be perfected, then the material needs to be nurtured. So to nurture the material, it's even a divine requirement. And how do you nurture the material? How do you nurture the material? How do you nurture the body? You need a society of persons. You need a society to do that. So in every human society, a society of all, you have the human person contributing his own part of perfection from the immaterial side of him and needing the support to perfect his or her own material aspect that needs more perfection. In this very interaction of the need for perfection of the material arises what we now understand as the common good, the second principle of the Catholic social teaching. How do we enable the person to communicate his or her own perfection? And how do we enable the person to perfect his or her own imperfection? Then we need a kind of an atmosphere to allow that. And the atmosphere must be social, since we all need something and we all make those interactions. The atmosphere must be concrete. It's not just, it cannot be abstract. And the atmosphere must be spiritual, because the human person is all material and immaterial. These social, spiritual, and material conditions is what we call the common good. Some would say that common good is not a collection of individual goods. You know, there's a way we understand common good to be. I've got something good going on in my life, like I've just been able to acquire something. You have got, he has got, she has got. The collection of those, permit my English, the collection of those form of getting, so to speak, is a common good. No. But rather, you are talking about the condition with which that is made, conditions made available in which individual persons can reach their fulfillment. That is what we understand as a common good. See the connection between the person and the common good. The person is whole. He or she needs, despite that he or she is whole, he or she needs the perfection. So by his wholeness, he contributes good to the community. By his or her imperfection, he or she needs goods into his or her life. And I'm going to conclude by saying from the thoughts of, from the words of Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain would say that for the common good to be good, it has to be intrinsically good. It has to be morally good. The federal government made a statement during the arrest of Sowore, and I'm concluding with this. When Sowore was arrested, there were commentaries by the officers of the federal government, especially those, the communication aides of the government. And repeatedly, they used a particular word that I was wondering where they got it from. But those are words that have been used by various governments in the world. And they said, for the good of the nation, for the good of the nation, for the security of the nation, Sowore needed to be arrested. That is possible, but that needed to be clarified. A government cannot, for example, a government does not possess, a government should not possess the power to kill, the power to destroy someone of his or her life, and refer to it as common good. It's not good in itself. So there's absolutely no way that someone can be dispossessed of his or her life and we refer to that as good, because for it to be good, it has to be intrinsically good. But the question should have been, what am I talking about? Jesus died on the cross, right? When someone is dispossessed or he or she chooses to sacrifice for the sake of the common good, then the person exercises his or her own capacity to choose. And that was exactly what Jesus did, right? He exercised his capacity to choose, and he chose to do that. So that is seriously different from what the federal government said. That was last year. I mean, there's a difference between what Jesus did and what the federal government said about Sowore. I will conclude this session by saying that there is no person that reaches its perfection or his or her perfection without a common good. And there is no perfection to be reached without a person contributing or adding his good to the good of the communion of the community. Thank you. Hi, Ether.